and I'm the Extension Urban Ag Outreach Specialist working under Kathleen Dellett on the new Extension Urban Ag Catalyst project. This is our fourth webinar, and we encourage everyone to go back and check out previous webinars at the project website, which is linked in the chat, extension.iowastate.edu/urbanag. Scroll to the bottom to sign up for our newsletter, where you will get latest updates about future webinars as well. We're grateful today to be joined by Ashley Dean. Ashley is an extension specialist for field crop entomology at Iowa State University Extension. During the webinar, she'll provide an overview of the types of pests, strategies for urban farms, and additional resources for further learning. Her presentation will be followed by a Q&A session. Ashley earned a bachelor's degree in agronomy and a master's degree in entomology, both from Iowa State. In her current role, she coordinates the Iowa Moth Trapping Network, the Regional Corm Rootworm Monitoring Network, and the Iowa Pest Alert Network. She spends her summers on the road conducting research trials related to insect pests in Iowa field crops and speaking at field days. She also helps to develop educational resources and delivers presentations about field crop insect pests. Please submit your questions by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom application. It'll open a dialog for submitting questions. And without further ado, Ashley, you can get started and share your screen.
Okay. Hopefully you can see just the presentation now.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, thank you, Graham, for the wonderful introduction, and thank you all for joining today. I'm really excited to present this topic to you guys. I'm hoping some of it should be a little bit of review, because I'm sure many folks are already doing a lot of these things and thinking about them. But I am hoping, I wonder if this toolbar is this toolbar in the way? Okay, there we go. Okay. I am hoping that presenting some of this in this way as like integrated pest management will help you think about pest management a little bit differently. So, oh, there we go. Okay. So, because I think a lot of the people who would be joining this webinar, I likely have not had the pleasure of interacting with. I was going to do a brief introduction of myself, but Graham really did a great job of introducing me. But I will tell you a little bit about what I do. So my role is in field crop entomology, a little bit different than some of the things that we're talking about today. But my job is a little bit unique because my role is 50% research, 50% extension, and not too many staff positions have that kind of 50-50 split. I really like doing this. Like Graham said, during the summer, I am spending a lot of time on the road, very hands-on with the research that we're doing as part of the soybean research lab. And I really enjoy that part of my job. It keeps me really up to date on actually what's going on in fields across Iowa. The other part of my job is what you might think of as very traditional extension work, right? Giving presentations, doing some publications like newsletter articles and things like that. I've also been part of some of our bigger publications like the Field Crop Production Handbook and Field Crop Insects. So depending on what you're doing, you might find those resources useful. I also help with some tools that we have for farmers, like our pest maps and forecasting webpage, primarily geared toward field crop pests, and then also the Iowa Pest Alert Network. Both of these things are really exciting for us, kind of new things that we're doing. I also coordinate the Corn Rootworm Monitoring Network and post a summary of that every single year. And then the most recent addition to kind of my list of things that I do is I am now one of the state coordinators for North Central SARE, which is the Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education Program in Iowa. So hopefully some of you have been able to interact with SARE, but I'm happy to answer questions about that if you might have them. So you might notice that my background is largely in field crop entomology. Um, so I may not be able to answer like really specific questions that you might have about a particular pest that you're experiencing. Um, However, I do think that there is a lot of overlap between what we see in some of the practices that we use in field crops and also in urban situations. So, kind of on that note, I in our extension program for field crop insects, we spend a lot of time talking about integrated pest management. I'm not sure how widely that term is used in horticulture or like urban ag. So I'm hoping to just review what IPM is, and hopefully you'll have a good understanding of integrated pest management principles. Like I said, I think these are things that you all are already thinking about, probably doing in your urban farms. But hopefully this makes you think about it in a little bit different of a way. So we'll go through that, and then we'll also review different types of pests that you might encounter. Important things to consider for those types of pests, and then strategies that you could potentially use to help manage those pests. And then at the end, I'll provide some resources, but I have also created a PDF with some links to those resources. I can share it at the end, or I think I had shared it with Graham. I'm not sure if he could share that with you in the chat. So we'll start with what is integrated pest management. There's a lot of definitions, and they're probably all right. But what integrated pest management is to me is trying to be proactive when we're thinking about different pests that we might encounter, using varied management techniques to try to manage those pests. And ultimately, we're looking to suppress pests. I think it's really hard to ensure that we're like 100% pest free, that we won't see any, insects, weeds, diseases in our fields. I think that's pretty unreasonable to expect. But if we can suppress them to a point where they are not causing any economic stress for our crops, that's really the goal of integrated pest management. Ultimately, we want to minimize risk for those pests, and the ultimate goal is sustainable crop production. I think a lot of people, when they hear like the term integrated pest management, think of biological control, and that certainly is a piece of it, which I'll show you in the next slide, but it really is more than biological control. We have a lot of tools at our disposal that fall under integrated pest management. So I really like this diagram that kind of outlines all of the major components of a successful IPM program. I think the things at the top are what people think of the most, right? These are the different kinds of management strategies that we often deploy against pests. But some of the things that like scientists spend a lot of time thinking about are kind of those smaller things at the bottom of this diagram. Like it's really important just to know how to identify a pest. And then we spend a lot of time thinking about how to sample for that pest, like what is the most accurate way to determine what that population is like. We think about how those pests behave, what their life cycles are, how they vary throughout the year, how they might overwinter. All of those things are really, really important to developing a successful IPM program. You may not necessarily be thinking about them as much as scientists are, but just know that when we make management recommendations for specific pests, these are kind of all the things that go into making those management recommendations. You'll see also at the very center of this diagram is economics. At the end of the day, if a management strategy will not pay off for a farmer, it just simply doesn't make sense for them to use that management strategy. So we like to keep those things in mind as well. I won't go into detail right now on all of the management strategies at the top of the diagram because we'll go into those a little bit in some of the next few slides. So why think about using IPM in urban ag? Like I said, I really do think that most of you probably are already thinking about this in one way or another. But some of the reasons that we really prioritize integrated pest management and why we promote it in our field crop audiences is for a variety of reasons, and it's really the same for urban ag. We want to help the farmer by minimizing input costs. If we don't need to manage a pest, then we we want to make sure that farmers are making the best financial decisions possible. So if a pest does not need to be managed, we don't want to have to use some sort of reactive tactic. We also want to protect beneficials, non-targets, and the environment. All of those things are really, really important, and one of the main reasons for using integrated pest management. We also think about something called resistance management. And this is just to try to preserve all of the management strategies that we have for the future, because some things, especially like chemicals, can anytime that we put them out into the environment is a chance for that pest to overcome it. And so if we can, use them sparingly and in a good way, we can preserve those for the future. Because we really don't have a ton of tools at our disposal. And so these are just some things to think about. But our overall goal is to reduce risk, right? Financial risk for the farmer, environmental risk to all of the good things that are in the environment. Overall, our goal is just to reduce risk. So the next section, we'll go over some of those pest management strategies that were kind of at the top of that diagram that I showed you. The very first thing that I wanted to say is it's really important just to make sure that you set plants up for success, right? And this really doesn't have anything to do with the pest management side of things, but if plants are doing well and planted into an environment that's suitable for them, they tend to do a lot better and can tolerate some pest pressure. So choosing the best cultivar is step number one. This could be just choosing the cultivar that is most adapted for your environment. It could be a resistant or tolerant cultivar if one is available for a specific pest. But it could also be just making sure that the seed and transplants that you're using are certified pest-free, coming from a good place that uses good pest management strategies. Also, all of these agronomic things that you're probably already thinking about are really important to making sure plants are successful, right? We need suitable site conditions. In Iowa, we have to think about planting after the danger of frost. And then one thing that is important for many pests like pathogens and insects that are living in the soil is to think about planting into warm and dry soil conditions, because some of those pests really thrive in cool, wet conditions. And so if the plants are growing slowly, not germinating when there's not germinating and growing as quickly as we'd like them to, those pests have more time to attack them and potentially cause issues. Lastly, thinking about timely harvest and sanitation. This could be during the growing season or after the growing season, after everything has been harvested. And this just helps to minimize the risk of injury to the crop, the actual thing that we're going to be harvesting and selling, or minimize the risk of pests overwintering in an area where we want to plant that crop again. So the first type of pest management strategy is called physical control. These are things like barriers, row covers, like you see in this picture. Anything that is an actual barrier to the pest getting to the crop, that would be a physical control. Also, removing pests, squishing them on plants, those are all examples of physical control. A classic one I think of that you see on the screen is Japanese beetles. Everyone deals with Japanese beetles. And one way to try to manage those is if you can catch them when there aren't too many, just knocking them into like soapy water can be pretty effective for some people. Using different types of traps. The one that I have here is a yellow sticky trap that we use for corn rootworm adults, but there are traps that work for all kinds of insects. Those can be used as well as a physical control. Cultural control is probably the hardest one to generalize, but this involves just altering the environment to be less suitable for pests. So you can see a list here on this slide of a ton of things that are pretty commonly used in different cropping systems, but there are so many more. There's a ton of things that fall under this category. Some ones that I think are pretty common is like row spacing, plant density, altering your planting date to try to escape pest pressure, using tillage or mulching would all be considered cultural control. Weed control itself is also cultural control in some respects. Crop rotation is a huge one for pests, for like diseases and also insects. Crop rotation is a huge one. So just making the environment less suitable for a specific pest. We kind of talked about biological control, and people are typically pretty familiar with this one. But biological control is just using natural enemies of a pest to try to help control it. And one thing that I think is great is that a lot of times these things are just naturally occurring. And so you don't actually have to do anything in order to have a good amount of biological control in your field. People often think of like beneficial insects like predators and parasitoids and those sorts of things as being biological control. But I did want to mention that there are pathogens that are considered beneficial, like different bacteria, fungi that will feed on insects, nematodes that might feed on insects as well. Those would be also biological control. Sometimes these things can be introduced, but unless you're operating in a closed production system, like a greenhouse or a hoop house or something like that, it may not be worth the money to actually go and buy biological control agents and introduce them because sometimes they don't stay put where they are, especially in the case of like insects that have wings. They'll just kind of go wherever there's a food source. And so just think about that. If it works out and is an economical choice to introduce your own biological control agents to your garden or whatever, definitely they can be really effective. You can also encourage biological control with flowering plants. A lot of the insects that provide biological control as adults, they need like nectar and pollen for food. So having flowering plants nearby could encourage biological control in your fields. The last type of pest management strategy is chemical control. So this is definitely part of the entire picture when we think about integrated pest management. So this is just using some sort of a chemical product to manage pests. All of the organic options would be considered biopesticides. So they're generally considered safe for the environment and non-targets and beneficials. They would be coming from natural materials like plant extracts, minerals, that sort of thing. They tend to be most effective on young insects, small weeds, or recently established pathogens. They tend to be less effective once we have like adult insects or pathogens that have kind of already taken over. I tend to think of chemical control as sort of a last resort, usually because these things are pretty expensive compared to some of the other things that we can do to help us manage pests. So, and another thing to consider too is that many applications might be necessary. So on top of them being expensive, they also, that cost can really start to add up if we have to have multiple applications of a pesticide. So with that, we will transition and talk about different types of pests. I'll start with weeds. Admittedly, this is probably the one that I know the least about. Identifying weeds is not something that I am super skilled at. But the definition of a weed also varies, much like the definition of integrated pest management. A very simple definition would be an unwanted plant. Um, I was talking to a weed scientist, and she was telling me that a good definition of a weed is a plant that really thrives under disturbed environments, which, if we're doing agriculture, pretty much every type of agriculture would be considered a disturbed environment. And so we see weeds a lot in these environments. But basically, it's any plant that is stealing nutrients, water, sunlight from the main crop. So this could even be something like a rogue tomato plant, one that didn't get cleaned up from last season, that could be stealing nutrients and water from our main crop of tomatoes. So it really just is any unwanted plant. A weed could also serve as a host for pests, or it could be unsightly or harmful to humans or like pets or animals that are in the area. Some weeds are toxic or they have like spines that could be painful. Some things that you might need to consider if you are really focused for whatever reason on identifying a specific weed is to distinguish between broadleafs versus grasses. You may also need to use reference guides to help you understand if it's an annual weed or if it's something that might be coming back year after year. And weeds are generally easiest to control when they're small. This is also when they are the most difficult to identify, in my opinion. So I highly recommend using reference guides or a very knowledgeable person to help identify weeds if you need to. Some examples of weed management, kind of following those categories that we talked about earlier. Physical control would be things like using mulch, using tillage, even just pulling weeds by hand. That would all be considered physical control. You might have heard of solarization or the stale seedbed technique. If that is something that would work for your operation, that could be considered physical control of weeds. Cultural control, we have things like cover crops, intercropping, altering the row spacing or plant density so that there's more canopy cover to kind of prevent weeds from emerging or growing rapidly. We also have crop rotation that can be really helpful for weed management. For biological control, there are some allelopathic compounds that some plants put out through their roots that can suppress the growth of other plants. So we could potentially use that as a biological control. There are also insects that will feed on weeds or weed seeds, pathogens that will do the same. Some mammals as well will just dig through the soil to try to feed on weed seeds. Some important considerations when thinking about weed management. What is the life cycle of the weed? Is this a weed that you would have to deal with for multiple years, or would taking care of it now prevent something that would prevent something from being a longer term problem? How does the weed disperse? Some of them disperse through their root systems. Some have, well, most plants would have seeds that would disperse in various ways. How does it disperse? Could it be a trap crop? So could you use it actually as a pest management strategy for a particular pest? Or would it be serving as a host for pests that would then spill over into the crop? So next I'll talk about insects and their relatives. This is, because I am an entomologist, this is my favorite type of pest. And I could probably do an entire webinar series on insects alone, but I'll try to keep it brief for this particular webinar. So how do I know that what I have is an insect? An insect will have 3 body regions, 3 pairs of legs, and 2 pairs of wings as an adult. And that's still pretty generalized. There are a lot of exceptions to those rules, and definitely immature insects do not have wings, right? And so they don't follow those rules. But if you're curious what you're seeing is an insect, that's a good place to start. From there, you can use lots of features of insects to help you identify specifically what insect you're looking at or to narrow it down. So you could use different types of wings if they have wings to help you narrow it down. You can also use their mouth parts or the type of injury that you're seeing on the plants to help you identify an insect. Actually, one of the most useful things, if you are maybe asking me or someone else what might be feeding on your crop, is actually knowing what you found it on. What's the host? And then even within that, where is it occurring on the plant can help us really narrow it down because sometimes those are really specific pests and we can just tell you based on what it's feeding on. You can also use things like antennae type, legs, how many it has, what type it has. Size, shape, color, patterns are all a little bit less reliable, but can also help. These things are not insects, but are often lumped with entomology, and I often get questions about all of these things. So things like spiders, mites, snails, slugs, millipedes, centipedes, and roly-polies or isopods. Those are all things that kind of get lumped in because when they're feeding on plants, they often do a very similar type of feeding. So we get asked about those a lot as well, but it would be important to distinguish between things that are insects and things that aren't because the management strategies might be a little bit different. So some things to look for if you think you have insects in your field or if you just want to be scouting. Look for the insects themselves. If you plan to make some sort of a rescue treatment, it's only effective if the insects are actually still there. You could also look for frass, which is just insect poop. So if you've ever seen like a corn earworm on a corn ear, which is on this slide, actually, the oatmeal-y part is the insect frass. You could also look for plants that don't look normal. So if there are pieces missing, if there's discoloration, if the plants are really sticky, that could also be an indication of something that we call honeydew, which is from a particular type of insect feeding there for a really long time. So look for all of those things to help you understand if there are insects present. Some examples of insect pest management techniques. We talked a little bit earlier about removing like Japanese beetles from plants. So removing or squishing insects is a good way and is under physical control. If you have ever dealt with aphids, those are really soft-bodied, so you can actually just squish them while they're feeding on the plants. But that really only works if you're, at a really small scale. You can also use traps. You can use netting or row covers to help protect plants from insects. Under cultural control, crop rotation is a really big one because many insects are very specific, host specific. And so if you just rotate away from that crop or keep a pretty good distance, though that can really help to manage insect pests. Altering planting date, doing tillage can sometimes be effective, and then planting a trap crop can also help draw insects away from the main crop. We also have biological control. We talked about that a lot, right? Preserving natural enemies, but also if you are in a closed production system, maybe releasing natural enemies could be a good option for you. So some important considerations. Does the insect overwinter? So does that mean that it can survive the winter here in Iowa? Because if it can, that can be something that we see every single year. It could be a more persistent problem. What life stages of the insect actually damage the plant? That can help you kind of hone in scouting and know what to look for. How long and when does feeding occur? So that's kind of that's kind of getting at what is the life cycle of that insect? How long will they be there? And when do I need to be looking for those symptoms? And then, does the insect vector a disease? This can be really important because sometimes if an insect is a vector, controlling the insect is the best way to control the disease. So with that, our next type of pest is diseases. There are a few categories of things that cause a disease. So fungi are probably maybe one of the biggest groups of pathogens that cause a disease. We also have bacteria, viruses, and nematodes. All of those things would be the pathogens that can cause disease in plants. I think that diseases tend to be really, really easily confused with disorders because the symptoms just mimic some things that might be like more of an agronomic problem in the field. So things like nutrient deficiencies, genetic mutations in plants, an incorrect water supply like over or under watering, all of those things can look very similar to the symptoms uh, that you might see with diseases. But one thing to remember is that diseases are biotic, so they're caused by something that's living, and disorders are abiotic. So those would be things that are like a genetic thing or something in the environment that would need to be managed to prevent those symptoms from happening. So some things to look for with diseases. Again, we're looking for plants that don't look normal, right? It could be stunted plants, misshapen fruits, discolored leaves or mottled leaves, wilting, like we see in this picture. Wilting or curled leaves can all be symptoms of diseases in plants. Even dead plants, if you see a couple of dead plants or some dead plants mixed in with plants that are starting to die, that could indicate a disease. Also, check for insects because some things, especially like viruses, tend to be vectored by insects, right? And so looking for the insects can help understand what's going on. So how to identify a disease? I think diseases, again, are one of the hardest things to identify unless you are very, very skilled at this. Some things you might see every single year and you kind of know what those symptoms look like. But if you want to know for sure, it usually requires an expert to diagnose a disease issue in a field. So some things that plant pathologists think about in terms of terminology. Symptoms are different from signs. Symptoms are like what we just talked about. Plants look sick. That's the discoloration that you might see, the wilting, things like that. That would be a symptom. But a sign is actual evidence of the pathogen. And that's often the thing that can 100% diagnose a disease that might be happening. But also the thing that I think most of us can't do. And so it would require sending some samples off to a lab. And I have a link to the Plant and Insect Diagnostic Center here at Iowa State. And they do an excellent job of handling these kinds of requests. So you could send in plant samples and get a diagnosis for issues that you might be seeing. Another thing that is important to remember with diseases is something called the disease triangle. So this is a really important concept in plant pathology where all three of these things must be true in order for a disease to develop. If even one thing is not true, a disease cannot develop. So we have to have a susceptible host, we have to have a pathogen in the environment, and we have to have a favorable environment. Usually the most limiting factor is the environmental conditions. We have to have usually pretty specific environmental conditions for a particular disease to develop. But if one of those things is not true, we won't get disease development. So some examples of disease management that you could be doing is physical control. this could look like vector control. So if we're thinking about diseases that are vectored by insects, just controlling the insect could be a good way to manage a disease. We also have soil sterilization um, that could be used to manage diseases that might be overwintering in the field or might be soil-borne. And then sanitation and harvest is very important. We covered that sort of at the beginning. One thing that I didn't put on this slide, but I wanted to mention is part of the disease triangle is having a susceptible host, and that's why one of the um, best ways to prevent a disease is if you're able to, if there is a cultivar that is available that's resistant to a particular disease, using that as like the first line of defense is really, really important. Some cultural control strategies would be things like crop rotation, cover crops, but also irrigation. So specifically for diseases, it's typically reducing irrigation or just irrigating certain areas so that we don't have super wet leaves that would be attractive to certain diseases. Biological control would look like an application of a biopesticide. And one thing I wanted to mention is most of the biopesticides that we have target fungal pathogens. So that's why knowing exactly what pathogen caused a disease might be important for some of the things that you might want to do to help manage those diseases. Because if it's not a fungus, most of these biopesticides are probably not going to work. So some important considerations, sort of like what we talked about with insects, does the pathogen overwinter? If the pathogen overwinters, then sanitation is probably very important. It might be something that we have to think about every single year. So knowing the life cycle of a particular pathogen is pretty important. What environmental conditions are needed for that disease to develop? We talked about the triangle, and usually the most limiting factor is the environmental conditions. So just keeping an eye on those if you're worried about a particular disease could be very important. Is there a resistant cultivar available for a particular disease? That would be the first line of defense against a lot of these diseases. And then which pathogen causes the disease? We just talked about that. Knowing what pathogen causes the disease is important for understanding how to manage that disease. Okay, our next category of pests, and the last category of pests, is larger animals. These are things that you probably already know how to deal with if you're dealing with them in your field. Some things to look for with these. I'm not going to go over identification of them because they're typically animals that most of us are familiar with, and generally kind of hard to generalize. But things to look for are plants or fruit that are like completely missing, or plants or fruit that have really big chunks taken out. And I say that kind of thinking about insects as well, because insects, when they have chewing mouth parts, will take smaller bites. You definitely wouldn't see like what you see with this watermelon here. An insect would never cause that kind of injury, but something with a much bigger mouth part would do that. So that would be probably some sort of a mammal that's doing that. So large chunks of plants, larger holes in fruit. Another thing that they might do is dig in the soil. So you might see evidence of digging. You might see piles of fruit. You might see missing plants. That would be something that would probably be a larger animal. So some examples of management, you could use fences. Those are generally pretty effective for a lot of the animals that we deal with in urban spaces. One thing to keep in mind for animals that can dig is to just put that fence, 6 inches below the ground as well, so that they have a harder time getting under the fence. People can also use raised beds to help keep some animals out. And then you could always resort to a live trap as a humane way to kind of relocate an animal if it's becoming an issue. Cultural control might look like having a trap crop. So if you just give them maybe a patch of something delicious to eat, they might leave your main crops alone. And also chemicals would be like we have a lot of repellents available to us that could be used. It could be the kind that are, bought in a store, but it could also be some plants that you might be able to use certain plants as like a border around a particular site to help kind of repel animals just based on some of the chemical qualities that those plants have. So I wanted to share a few final thoughts on integrated pest management for urban farms. And this is something that we talk about a ton in field crops as well, is just to be proactive. So we want to set our plants up for success. All of those things we talked about at the beginning. If we can make our plants be as healthy as possible, but also grow quickly and vigorously in the spring, they have a much better chance of outrunning some of those really early season things that we might be concerned about. This also helps to minimize the risk of pest establishment. So anything that we can do, those cultural control tactics, things like that, using resistant varieties if they are available, can all minimize the risk of pest establishment. But sometimes the pest finds a way, right? And so I recommend that people look for pests. I pointed out some things that you could look for all of these different categories of pests, but it is important to just keep an eye on things, be as unbiased as possible because we can't expect there to be zero insects, zero diseases, zero weeds in our field. But if we're seeing, a widespread issue in a particular area, then we might need to do something about that. So scout fields for pests during the growing season. And just know that most plants can tolerate some level of pests. I don't work with horticulture crops very often, so you all probably know this much better than me, especially if you are someone who is growing a horticulture crop and also trying to market that crop directly to consumers. Sometimes aesthetics matter. So oftentimes there is a zero tolerance policy. So, these little divots in this melon would be considered unacceptable to some consumers, right? And so if there's a zero tolerance policy, sometimes we have to take more extreme measures and we can't tolerate really any level of pest pressure in those types of crops. And that's a little bit harder. We do have to be more on top of scouting, making sure that we're doing all of the proactive things to try to minimize them to keep them from establishing. So some things to consider are, the value of the crop. What's the end use? Is it being directly marketed to consumers? And if it is, what are their perceptions of potentially having, a few holes taken out of a particular plant? So those are all a little bit harder to sort of make recommendations for, but just know that all of these things that we talked about throughout this webinar are things that you can try to do to help minimize these kinds of things from happening. So lastly, I promised you some resources that might be helpful. So some field guides have integrated pest management information for specific crops and specific pests. So two that I found that I thought did a really, really great job of this were the Midwest Fruit Pest Management Guide and also the 2025 Midwest Vegetable Production Guide. Both of those seem to be pretty thorough and had really good recommendations for a lot of very specific crops. They are both available through the ISU Extension Store, but hopefully I can provide you with a document that has direct links as well. Those field guides do not often have resources on weeds, weed identification, or even management. And so if you need a separate resource for weed identification, these are two really great ones, the weed identification guide from Iowa State, and then there's also one or from Wisconsin that I've been told is really good. You might also consider using some plant identification apps like PlantNet or iNaturalist. Those can sometimes be really helpful in identifying weeds. Some things that I wanted to just note for apps like plant identification apps or even like iNaturalist can also identify insects for you. As someone who gets a lot of pictures of insects for identification, these are just some notes for you if you are planning to use that. Take a good photo, make sure there's good lighting, make sure that you're focusing really well, that your camera is focusing, and make sure you're zoomed in enough that you can see what you need to see in order to identify that insect or plant. Sometimes location might be important. So like iNaturalist is one that I've used a few times. And sometimes it's really to get an accurate identification, you need to be standing like right where you found the thing. So just keep that in mind. And then I always recommend to double check with another source. It could be a website, it could be one of those field guides that we talked about, or it could be someone like me to help you with insect ID or someone who's really knowledgeable with plant ID. Always double check with another source because apps can only do so much, especially based on what kind of a picture is put into the app. Some helpful campus resources. I kind of mentioned the Plant and Insect Diagnostic Clinic already. They help to diagnose plant issues, and they can identify insects and nematodes as well. Fees do apply when you send in a sample, but just know that they are available to you and usually quite prompt in getting back to you if you send in a sample. There are also people on campus in the horticulture department that are invaluable resources to you for specific questions that you might have. There are also a couple of horticulture field specialists who might be able to visit your farm. And then I recommend signing up for the Yard and Garden newsletter. They will deliver timely topics to your email, so that could be a good way just to stay up on what's going on, what other people are seeing. And I think that's it for me. I went a little bit over time. I am so sorry about that. I told Graham that I would not have 40 minutes worth of content, but I am wrong apparently. So that's all I've got. I'm happy to answer questions if you have them. Otherwise, I can be reached by email or in other ways as well.
Thanks, Ashley. It's okay that we're over time, I think. People can still go ahead and submit questions. We can answer a few while we still have a little bit of time. I'll just read them aloud to you. We just got one that's asking, has ISU Extension researched land race vegetables? I believe that's how you pronounce it, other than corn in terms of pest/disease resistance. If so, could you please share resources? So they're asking for resistant crops other than corn or resistant vegetables, I suppose.
That is that is an excellent question. I do know, I work with corn quite a bit, so I know that there is a very successful breeding program for corn pest issues, but I am not familiar with some of the other vegetable crops. I could look into this, and if I find anything, I could send it to Graham and hopefully could send it to the group.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you.
Okay.
I also don't have an answer for that, despite
I
being
know.
located in horticulture. But there may be some horticulture specialists who is working on something like that here with their labs.
Yeah, I think I know that there's some work in like potatoes, but I don't know specifically if it would be like an organic solution. So I would have to look into it.
I had a question, or I just wrote, could you elaborate more on what solarization is in terms of weed management?
Yes, I thought about going into more detail, but I, I already went over time. But solarization and also like sterilization of the soil um, is commonly used. I guess they can be used at different times, but they're generally the same-ish thing. But basically, what you could do is before weeds start to emerge, you could lay down like a black plastic mulch or like a tarp on the soil and use that as kind of a conductor. So when the sunlight hits it, it's basically like baking the soil, which can help to kill some weed seeds that might be close to the soil surface. But also, I mentioned that that could be used for pathogens as well, and probably honestly for insects that are in the soil. If they're pretty close to the soil surface, just heating the soil surface can help to kill some of those things.
Thank you for the elaboration. I had not heard of it before,
Oh,
but it was nice to hear about it.
yeah, I'm not sure if it would be something that would be kind of expensive to do. I'm not sure what that like plastic mulch would cost. But definitely could be an option for maybe smaller scale or if you just have like a really persistent problem and it's definitely something that overwinters in the soil or weed seeds are kind of always there, could be an option.
Okay. We had a question or a follow-up that was asking for specific products that could sanitize soil.
Um, for the soil sanitation, I think like probably most things that would be considered like a fumigant could be used for soil sanitation. I'm not sure. I'm not super familiar with those, right? So if you're in like an organic system, I'm not sure if there are organic fumigants. That's not really my specialty, but I think they would be considered fumigants. I don't have specific product recommendations, but that would be, um, I think also with soils, sanitation, you could potentially use like various, if you're doing this for like weed management, you could potentially use different herbicides combined with like uh the tarp or the mulch on the soil to help get rid of those things.
Okay. Um, I'll speak one more question, and then we can kind of wrap up. But this person asks, are you suggesting that we move away from plastic mulch due to its breakdown and entering the water? Is that a consideration, or is that true?
Oh, I definitely think that's a consideration. I am not making any recommendations specifically because I don't work with these things very often, but I have in my reading, I have heard that those are definitely concerns. So, a lot of people, especially in organic systems, have been switching to different types of mulches that would be more biodegradable or even sometimes reusable because I think the recommendation is if you were to continue to use like the plastic mulches, hopefully you could reuse them over multiple seasons to get more life out of those. But most people don't want to do that. Um, and so I think there is kind of a push to try to find mulches that are more sustainable. I know that they make some now that are like still, they're not like the wood mulches and things that you put down or straw mulches. They are like a material that you can buy, but they are more environmentally friendly.
Okay, good to know. Well, I'll conclude the webinar with that. Thank you so much for joining us, Ashley, and thanks for everyone who could make it. If you have further questions, feel free to reach out to either me or Ashley. We are here to, support this new urban agriculture project. If you'd like to hear more about the project, visit the extension website for Urban Ag and keep an eye out for the next webinar, which will be on May 1st. Thank you.